Business news now on the programme. Brian is with us today. He's starting in the US. The latest inflation data is causing some major concern, Brian.
It is, Stuart. U.S. inflation coming in hotter than expected for the third straight month as the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its readings for March on Wednesday. The Consumer Price Index up 3.5% on an annual rate. That is 0.3% higher than February's reading and 0.1% higher than had been projected. Core inflation, which strips out volatile sectors like food and energy, sitting even higher at 3.8%. Perhaps most troubling, though, for the Biden administration is the super core reading, which also strips out housing prices. That hit 4.8% on a yearly basis, suggesting that inflation in the U.S. is going to be a stickier problem than previously expected. Now, U.S. interest rates are at a two-decade high as the Federal Reserve seeks to bring inflation down to its 2% target. Markets had been expecting the Fed to begin cutting rates in June as inflation cooled in previous readings. That scenario, though, is now very much in doubt. Purchasing power has been a big issue for voters in the run-up to this year's presidential election. Here's President Joe Biden.
Look, we have dramatically reduced inflation from 9% down to close to 3%. We're in a situation where we're better situated than we were when we took office, where inflation was skyrocketing. And we have a plan to deal with it, whereas the opposition, my opposition, talks about two things. They just want to cut taxes for the wealthy and raise taxes on other people.
Joe Biden there. What about the markets then today, Brian? How are they shaping up?
Well, Stuart, major U.S. indexes all dropped in the neighborhood of 1% on the back of that inflation data. Asian markets on Thursday are mixed, with Chinese indexes on either side of the flat line as the latest data shows consumer price indexes there falling by 1% on a monthly basis. Producer prices down 2.8% on the year as China faces deflationary pressures. The Nikkei in Tokyo, meanwhile, down 1/3% as the Japanese yen has hit a 34-year low, raising expectations that the Japanese government may once again step in to prop up the value of the struggling currency. Here in Europe, major indexes opening fairly flat as investors look ahead to the European Central Bank's interest rate decision due out later today. Chief Christine Lagarde expected to signal whether or not the ECB could begin cutting its rates ahead of the Fed as the Eurozone economy struggles with low and even a negative growth.
Finally, for business then, the UN's climate chief says the world has 2 years to save the planet.
In a speech Wednesday, Simone Steele warned that global warming is slipping down politicians' agendas. One of the main tasks at this year's UN climate negotiations in Baku will be finding agreement on a new target for climate finance to support developing nations hit hard by climate change. Tom Canetti has the story.
A warning to wealthy nations to overcome geopolitical divisions to tackle global warming. The UN climate chief says a quantum leap is needed in climate finance.
This year, at COP29 in Baku, we need to agree a new target for climate finance that meets developing country needs. But it's not enough to agree a target. We need a new deal on climate finance between developed and developing countries.
Climate finance has traditionally consisted of wealthy governments giving loans to developing countries to help them adapt to climate change. But Steele says new financing agreements need to be reached to unburden taxpayers in rich countries and help poorer ones escape debt.
Developing countries spent more than $400 billion servicing debt last year.
Suggested by the G20's chair, Brazil, one potential avenue would be to implement a minimum tax on billionaires. Another, discussed by governments at the International Maritime Organization, is to put a price on shipping emissions. But negotiators have suggested using that money to clean up the shipping industry, not for broader climate finance. And while current financing agreements may need reform, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development says more funding is needed. Wealthy nations likely provided $100 billion in climate finance to poorer nations in 2022, far from the estimated $2.4 trillion annually needed. In a bumper year for elections around the world, with voters going to the polls from India to South Africa and the United States, Steele warned too often climate action was slipping down cabinet agendas.
Climate finance also set to be a big topic at the spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund coming up in just about 2 weeks' time, so we'll see what comes out of those, Stuart.
And of course, Brian will be following it for us on France 24. Thanks very much, Brian.